Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101E. I am Chris Ann Moore, and this is Program 3, The Best Possible Answers. We understand now from Programs 1 and Program 2 that philosophy is a love of wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge of how to live the best of all possible lives and being able to live it consistently. We understand that this confronts us with a series of questions that have no definitive answer, and that there are some answers that are better than others, and that philosophers seek the best of all possible answers. Of course, in your life, you can use eeny, meeny, miny, mo, should you so choose. You can use rock, paper, scissors. Philosophers would disagree that those will give you the best of all possible answers, however. And what we're really doing in these two courses, in Program 2 and Program 3, is we are setting up the foundation for how you will answer ethical controversies and moral dilemmas in the future, and how your answer will be judged, not by your moral determination, but how you arrived at that moral determination. What was your reasoning behind that? Because you see, in our lives, we can't help confront moral dilemmas. As the 20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, we are condemned to be free. And what Sartre meant by that is that we cannot help but choose. We are confronted with questions, and we must answer them. For even if you are confronted with a question and you choose not to answer it, that in itself is a choice. And so we are confronted with choices day by day, year after year, and the answers to those choices shape our character, shape our world. And so philosophers demand the best possible answers. Now, philosophers may disagree on the answer to any particular moral dilemma or ethical controversy, but they do, for the most part, agree on the methods that can be used to distinguish the best possible answer. And so that is what we're going to be looking at today, how to arrive at the best possible answer. Now, in order to arrive at the best possible answer, you need an epistemology. An epistemology is simply a theory of knowledge. It deals with questions like, how can I know anything? And how can I know that I know? So, epistemology asks, how can we know anything, and how can we know that we know? Now, this is just a fancy word, really, for how do I know what the truth is? How do I know what to do? And the fact is that you actually already have an epistemology. Think of the last time you decided to trust a friend. On what basis did you make that decision? Did you look at your experiences with that friend? Did you listen to your instincts or your intuitions about that friend? Did you use common sense on what you knew about that friend? Did you listen to your feelings about that friend? Well, if you chose any of these, experience, intuition, feelings, common sense, you were looking at an epistemology. You used your epistemology to decide whether or not to trust the friend. And depending on how that worked out, you either revised your epistemology or you gained more confidence in it. If it turned out if your friend was indeed trustworthy, you would find that your epistemology was working, at least in that instance. If you found that, in fact, your friend was not trustworthy, you probably would revise your decision, revise your epistemology in some way. And actually, if in this class we debated about the epistemology you used, we would be having a philosophical debate about epistemology. Okay, so now you should understand what epistemology is. Philosophers have a very definite epistemology. Philosophers have a very definite way of discovering how truth can be determined. They may not have definitive answers, but they have definite methods. And what philosophers do is they use arguments to determine truth. Now, what is an argument? Well, an argument is definitely not a personal disagreement in which objects may be thrown at each other. That is the way argument is used in everyday life. But in philosophy, an argument is a persuasive appeal. An argument is a persuasive appeal. A number of statements called premises are given in order to persuade us to accept the philosopher's main point, which is called the conclusion. This will become clear as we look at it as an argument form. An argument form is really pretty simple. An argument form contains a number of statements called premises, statement 1, statement 2, statement 3, etc. There may be thousands of statements. And all those statements are meant to persuade us to accept a conclusion, which is really the main point of the argument. And in ethics, the main point of the conclusion is the final moral determination on a dilemma or on a controversy. Now, philosophy recognizes two types of arguments. There are inductive reasoning, arguments that use inductive reasoning, and there are arguments which would use deductive reasoning. In this program, we will be examining both types of reasoning, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So let's start with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning really, quite simply, uses experience in order to develop knowledge. This is the basic form of an argument in inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, evidence from experience is used to determine a general principle, and that general principle is used to predict a future occurrence. This should be very clear by an example. Let's say that I'm trying to decide when to have my wedding. I'm going to be married in New York, and I'm looking at the month of June. Let's look at an example of inductive reasoning. For my first premise, I found out, according to reports, in New York in June, most days were sunny last year. Now, for premise 2, I look at the almanac. The almanac says that in New York, most days in June have been sunny for the last 5 years. So, from these two premises, I can deduce the general principle that most days in New York in June are sunny. From that general principle, I can make a prediction. I will predict that if I have my wedding on a June day in New York, the sun will be shining. So, a simple series of statements drawn from experience that most days in June in New York are sunny, that the almanac says that for the last 5 years, most days in June in New York have been sunny. I deduce the general principle that most days in New York in June are sunny, and from that general principle, I then decide I'm going to have my wedding in June in New York. I will have a sunny day. Now, this is the kind of reasoning that thousands and thousands of brides use every year. That is where the term June wedding comes from, actually, from the East Coast, where June is sunny. Not only is it sunny, but there's not very many bugs yet in June because it hasn't gotten hot. And cathedrals and wedding rehearsal halls are booked up years in advance for June. All right, let's look at another example to see how inductive reasoning works. You're going to see that you use this kind of reasoning all the time. All right, inductive reasoning example 2. Premise 1. I had dinner at Moe's restaurant last week, and the food and service were wonderful. Premise 2. I had dinner at Moe's restaurant last weekend, and the food and service were wonderful. Premise 3. I had dinner last night at Moe's restaurant, and the food and service were wonderful. So what do you think the general principle I'm going to derive is? Well, of course. I now have a general principle that tells me the food and service at Moe's restaurant are wonderful. So I can use that, and the next time my family comes into town, I can make a prediction of the future. My prediction, if I take my family to Moe's restaurant, the food and service will be wonderful. From these examples, you should see the fact that we use inductive reasoning every day. We use it to determine what exercises work, what diets work, what shampoos we use, what friends to trust, what movies to go to. And for the most part, inductive reasoning leads to reliable beliefs. Now, reliable beliefs are beliefs that fit in with our other beliefs, and they seem to work. We use experience to determine general principles, and we make predictions of the future from those general principles. And most of the time, that seems to give us reliable beliefs. It seems to give us beliefs that work and that fit in with our other beliefs. Now, if we determine a general principle and it doesn't seem to work, we can revise it and determine new beliefs. This is how inductive reasoning works. We use it every day in our shampoos, in our friends, in our restaurants, in our films, etc. And it is also, for the most part, the reasoning that science uses. For example, when a pharmaceutical company wants to see if a drug works, they will test that drug on numerous subjects. Now, if the drug works on hundreds of people, for instance, if it cures disease symptoms or it alleviates pain in hundreds of subjects, then the pharmaceutical company will determine the general principle. This drug works in alleviating the symptoms of this disease. From that evidence, doctors will then use a general principle that says, if I prescribe this drug to my patients, it will alleviate the symptoms of this disease. And from that, they prescribe those drugs. Now, although inductive reasoning seems to lead to the most part to reliable beliefs, there is a flaw in inductive reasoning. The flaw in inductive reasoning is that inductive reasoning can never provide us with absolutely certain universal truth. Inductive reasoning can provide us with reliable beliefs, but not with certain universal truth. Now, many philosophers believe that when we use the term truth, we are referring to universal truth. What that means is if something is true for you, it is true for me. And if it's true for you and me, it is true for everyone. And that is what makes something true, the fact that it is universal. Now, you may ask yourself, do such universal truths exist? Well, it is most certain that they do, or at least it is most certain that most philosophers believe that they do. For example, mathematical truths. 2 plus 2 equals 4 can be considered a universal truth. 2 plus 2 equals 4 in New York, in Guam, in Nairobi, and in Hawaii. 2 plus 2 equaled 4 in 10,000 BC, and 2 plus 2 will equal 4 in 20,000 AD. 2 plus 2 equals 4 can be seen as a universal, certain truth. The truths of geometry, for instance, are universal, certain truths. The circumference of a circle divided by the diameter of a circle will yield pi, 3.14 every single time. It will yield pi if you use a basketball, if you use the diameter of the sun, if you use a circle in your backyard, in a pool. If you take the circumference of a circle, divide it by the diameter, you will get pi, 3.14. That is true in New York, in Guam, in Nairobi, and in Paris. And it is true always and for all time. Now, the question, of course, is there such universal, certain truth in philosophy? Can we find universal truths to the great philosophical questions? And many philosophers believe that we can. In fact, they insist that it's possible. For instance, if it is true that slavery is wrong, then it is true for me and you and everyone else. If it is true that slavery is wrong, it has always been true, and it will always be true. It may take us time to discover that truth, but that truth was nonetheless there. But inductive reasoning cannot yield certain truth. It cannot yield these universal, eternal truths. Why? Well, inductive reasoning uses experience, and experience is always limited, relative, and sometimes it's deceptive. Let's look what it means when we say that experience is limited. For instance, my experience, my life, I can live a very, very long time, and I can have a large number of experiences in that time. But no matter how long I live, and no matter how many experiences I have, there will be very, very few experiences, considering the experiences of all people that have ever existed or ever will exist. It's extremely limited. Let's look even at a scientific experiment that looks at the experiences of many, many people. It is still limited. For example, a scientific experiment that looked at, for instance, tested a drug on 10,000 people would be enormously ambitious by any standards. But still, 10,000 people is very small compared with the 6 billion people that are alive. 10,000 to 6 billion. But let's just imagine a scientific experiment in which you could test a drug on all 6 billion people alive today. Impossible, but let's imagine it. The results would still be limited because we can only test those people that are alive today. We cannot test everybody who has ever been alive for all time. So, experience is by its very nature limited. Let's look at that again. Experience is limited. No matter how many times something is experienced, we can never know the experiences of all people at all times in all places. For example, a drug that worked on all 6 billion people alive today would not be certain. We could not be certain that that drug would work on all people for all time. There would be no way for us to know that. All right, let's look at the fact that experience is relative. Experience is relative. Relative means dependent. That means we each experience things differently. How each of us experiences anything is dependent on our previous experiences, our genetics, our different cultures, our different expectations. My experience of an event may be very different from your experiences of an event. Let's look at an example. For instance, say I decided that I was going to cook the entire class a spicy meal, a nice, hot, spicy meal. And I serve this meal to all my students. As my students are eating the meal, some of them think, oh, hot, and they start yelling for water to drink. But other of my students are eating the meal and they're like, this isn't spicy. And these students are saying, could you get me some hot sauce? So was the meal spicy or was it not spicy? The answer, of course, is that it is relative. Whether you think the meal is spicy or not depends on your experiences, your culture, your background, your taste, the food that you've eaten before. It depends, in short, on you. Let's look at another example. Suppose you went to a party with a friend. You could go to this party and you were dancing all night and you were having a great time, and your friend was sitting in the corner, wanting to go home, thinking it was boring. So which was it? Was the party a blast or was the party a dud? Well, of course, the answer is it depends. You see, the way we experience anything is dependent on us. So experience cannot lead to universal certain truth because experience, by its very nature, differs from person to person. All right. Now let's look at another fact of experience, and that is experience is deceptive. Things are not always as they appear. Think about this. The earth is not flat. The sun is not a small disk up in the sky. And yet the sun appears like a small disk up in the sky. The earth appears flat. As a matter of fact, people thought the earth was flat for thousands of years. It took something more than immediate experience to figure out that the earth was round. Similarly, it took something more than immediate experience to figure out that the sun is a giant star 93 million miles away. Now, of course, now we have pictures of the earth, and we can see by immediate experience that it is a sphere. So you think perhaps we know the earth is round, but we cannot be certain that the earth is round. Think about this. Physicists now think about mathematical equations that go out to 11 dimensions. Naturally, we can't perceive 11 dimensions. Everything that we perceive is three-dimensional. However, that does not mean that 11 dimensions don't exist. Someday, we may have evidence to suggest that the Earth exists in 11 dimensions. Therefore, the perception of the Earth as a round object is extremely limited, and in fact, somewhat deceptive. I know, it may take a stretch of the imagination to believe that, but it is nonetheless true. We cannot be certain, based on our experience, that the earth is round, because experiences can deceive us. We can only experience what our senses are able to pick up. And in fact, our senses are extremely limited. Let's look at another example of the fact that experience is deceptive. Let's look at the fact that our senses are limited. What if I told you that in the room you are in right now, there are millions and millions of tiny organisms? You know it's true. In fact, there are bacteria and microorganisms all over your room. And you can't see them, thank God. But you can't see them. But they're there nonetheless. Do you know there's all sorts of things in your room that you can't see? All sorts of sounds that you can't hear? If you don't believe me, turn on a radio. If you turned on a radio in your room right now, you would hear music. Now, the music did not enter the room with your radio. The music is not inside the radio. In fact, the music was in your room all along. But you cannot hear radio signals. So until you had a receiver that could hear radio signals, you couldn't hear the music, but it was there. As a matter of fact, if you turn your radio tuner, you can hear classical, rap, jazz, blues. All of that music is in your room. The classical music is still in your room when you're listening to the blues. The blues are still in your room when you turn to the rap station. But the fact is you're only able to hear what you have tuned your radio to hear at that moment. You see, if we mapped out the entire spectrum of sound, we only hear a very small portion of what is available. Similarly, if we mapped out the entire light spectrum, we can only see a very small portion of what it is possible to see. We cannot see that which is extremely tiny. We cannot see the microorganisms that inhabit our room, which is obviously a good thing. We cannot hear the radio stations which are being beamed through our room, which is obviously a good thing because it would be horrible to be listening to all that music all the time. And not only radio stations coming through the room, there are cell phone conversations coming through your room. You just don't have the receiver for them. There are television programs being blasted through your room, satellite programs coming through your room in your body right now. Oh, there goes Ross and Rachel from Friends through my body. Oh, there goes another television show. But I can't see it because my senses don't pick that up. And just as there are radio programs and cell phone conversations that we don't hear and microorganisms that we don't see, these are things that we know about. What else could be in your room that is beyond your imagination? 11 dimensions? Perhaps there are other times and other spaces and other beings right here in the room. But our sense organs are only tuned to pick up a very small piece of that. So in reality, in a sense, our senses deceive us. Think about this. Our senses are limited. We only see a very small range of the visible spectrum, and we only hear a very small range of sound. So, since as we've seen, experience is limited, it's relative, dependent on us, and it can be deceptive, experience cannot lead to certain universal truth. It should be apparent to you by now that the examples I used at the top of the show, the example of my June day in New York, my sunny wedding, is it possible that it's going to rain on my day? Absolutely. Or let's look at my example of Moe's Restaurant. Is it possible that I take my family to Moe's Restaurant and the food and service are horrible that night? Absolutely possible. What's possible as well is that I will take my family to Moe's Restaurant and I will still think the food and service is wonderful, but my family will think it was terrible, that the service was slow and the food wasn't very good. because, of course, their experience is relative. So although inductive reasoning can lead to reliable beliefs, it cannot lead to certain truths. However, the reliable beliefs, the truths that we find through inductive reasoning, have various degrees of probability. Something can be considered to be unlikely, and something can be considered to be highly likely, depending on the type of inductive reasoning used. So when we look at the probable truths that we derive from inductive reasoning, probable truth is a statement that the evidence suggests is likely to be true. Probable truths are derived from strong inductive reasoning. Strong inductive reasoning has very certain characteristics. First of all, strong inductive reasoning uses a large number of samples. If you think about it, my 3 visits to Moe's restaurant is a very small number of experiences. It's a very small number of samples. On the other hand, the 10,000 people that we talked about a drug being tested on, now that would be a very large number of samples. Obviously, the more experiences that you refer to, the stronger your induction is going to be. However, a large number of samples is not enough to consider induction strong. You need more than a large number of samples. For instance, if that experiment done on 10,000 people was done only on white males from New York, that would not be considered strong induction. You need a large variety. You need a number of different types of people, different genders, different races, different cultures. As you have more types of people, and you examine the experience of more types of people, your induction becomes stronger. So therefore, if many people from many different cultures had found the food and service at Moe's restaurant to be good, we would consider that stronger induction. So, strong inductive reasoning, induction by enumeration, a large number of samples, and the use of representative samples, different cultures and different people. Representative samples means that you investigate the experience of many different people, both men and women, of different cultures from different backgrounds. However, in science, even using a large number of samples of many different types of people is not considered strong induction. A couple of other criteria must be met to consider induction strong. For example, scientists need to use a controlled study. A controlled study, that is a study in which as many variables as possible are kept constant, and only the factor under investigation is varied from group to group, so all noted differences can be attributed to that factor. Let's look at an example. For instance, let's look at a scientific study on diabetes. If scientists were studying diabetes, they would want to do a controlled study. They would want to study people whose diet and exercise were the same, and then they could only vary the insulin dosage. Therefore, any results that they discovered could be attributed to the insulin dosage rather than to other factors which interfered. However, even if you have a large number of samples, you have a varied representative sample, you do a controlled study, still that's not enough to be considered strong inductive reasoning. In strong inductive reasoning, in science, you still need one other thing. You need corroboration by an independent investigator. What does it mean? That means that a scientist, researchers that were not involved in the original experiment, are able to reproduce your experiment in their laboratories. This is to ensure that the prejudices or the desires of the original researcher didn't fog the reading of the evidence. It also sets it up so that any flaws in the scientific design will be revealed by the second researcher or the third researcher. So, in order to have strong inductive reasoning, you need to have a large number of experiences. You need to have the experiences of many different people at many different places at many different times. You need to have a controlled study. You need to have corroboration by independent investigators. So, it should seem obvious from all this that you can achieve strong inductive reasoning and highly probable truth, but it requires a lot of work to do so. And even then, even in the strongest induction, you still do not have certain universal truths. I know this. I worked in scientific laboratories for many years. I was a research associate in neurophysiology at the University of Illinois Medical School, and then I was a research associate in molecular biology at Northwestern University Medical School. And as a member of those teams, I participated in the publication of a large number of scientific papers. And I can promise you, we never, ever ended any scientific paper with, "It is now certain." We are absolutely sure that. It can be absolutely relied upon that. Because we knew that if we did so, we'd appear like idiots. No scientist with their degree is going to say that. And as a matter of fact, if they did, someone would say, go back and take introductory philosophy. Inductive reasoning cannot yield certain universal truth, but it can yield highly probable truth. However, it should be obvious by now that the highly probable truth, it should be obvious by now that in order to use strong inductive reasoning, you need the experiences of many people. Therefore, any reasoning that is based on our personal experiences is going to be weak induction. Whatever we decide to do based on only our own experience is based on weak induction. Now that's fine. It seems to work for us. We use it every day, as I said before. We make decisions based on weak induction, and they seem to work for us. But we need to realize that it is weak induction. We need to realize that those truths that we have determined based on our experiences are not universal truths, and we have no reason to believe that other people must agree with us. We have no reason to believe that everyone should listen to what we have to say based on our experience. Now it should be even more obvious why God said so is an inadequate answer. But even if your reasons for believing in God are clear, even if your reasons for believing you know God's will are clear for you, many times those reasons will be based on your experiences. For example, someone may believe in a divine command theory because they were broke and addicted and out on the streets. And when they found their God, their church, their book, they turned their lives around. And they found that that was a good reason to believe because it worked in their life. It made their life better. And that's a wonderful reason for a personal belief. But it must be recognized that it's a reason for a personal belief, not for a universal belief. But there is one other kind of reasoning that under very specific circumstances can be used to determine certain universal truth, and that is deductive reasoning. So now that we're done with inductive reasoning, we're going to look for a second at deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, logic is applied to given statements in order to arrive at a conclusion. The argument form in deductive reasoning is basically the same as that is used in inductive reasoning. Statements are given in order to support a conclusion. However, in deductive reasoning, logic is applied to those statements in order to derive that conclusion. Logic really is just common sense. We take statements, we apply common sense, and we use that to determine new truths. Let's look at the basic form of a deductive argument. The basic form of a deductive argument: premise, statement, premise 2, statement, apply logic, and get a conclusion. If good logic is used, that is called a valid deductive argument. A valid deductive argument is when good logic is used. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. That is the definition of a valid deductive argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true because logic or common sense says that that must be so. Again, this will become clearer by examples. Let's look at our first example of a deductive argument. Example 1. For my first premise, I'm going to use my car needs gas to start. For my second premise, I now know my car has no gas. Simple logic applied to those premises will let me conclude that my car won't start. Now, I don't need experience to back this up. If it is true that my car needs gas to start and my car has no gas, my car won't start. Common sense dictates that this must be so. I do not need to go out to my car and turn the key to see if it'll start. I do not have to have a representative sample of my neighbors all coming over trying to start my car. I know if my car needs gas and it has no gas, it won't start. All right, let's look at a second example. For premise 1, Socrates died in 399 BC. For premise 2, Jesus was born 400 years later. Just using these premises and common sense, I can conclude Socrates was not a Christian. Obviously, if Christianity started 400 years after Socrates died, Socrates was not a Christian. I don't need experience to figure this out. I don't need to talk to Socrates. I don't need to talk to Jesus. I know that Socrates was not a Christian if Christianity didn't start till 400 years after Socrates was dead. Simple common sense. Third example. There are no freshwater sharks in North America. Statement 1. From that alone, I can figure out if I'm going to go swimming in Lake Michigan, I don't have to worry about shark attack. If there are no saltwater sharks, if there are no freshwater sharks in North America, then if I go swimming in Lake Michigan, I don't have to worry about shark attack. So from these three examples, we should see that deductive reasoning is simply common sense applied to given statements. However, just like there is a flaw in inductive reasoning, there is also a flaw in deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, to conclude an absolute universal truth, you need two things. You need good logic, but you also need premises that are certain and universally true to begin with. Using common sense, using logic applied to statements, deductive reasoning, if I put in something false, then I can get out something false. If I put in something probably true, then I can get in something that's just get out something that is just probably true. So, if I want to conclude a certain universal truth using deductive logic, I need to start with certain universal truth. So, here's the problem. How to find certain universal truth to begin with? Where are we going to find this certain universal truth in order to use logic to find other certain universal truths? Why is this a problem? Well, think about it a second. In my example from my car has no gas. How did I discover that? Through experience. In my second example, Jesus was born 400 years after Socrates died. How do I know that? From an experience. There are no freshwater sharks in North America. I am using other people's experiences that I have relied upon. So the problem is, most premises used in deductive logic come from experience, from inductive reasoning. As you remember, this is a problem because experience is always limited, relative, and deceptive. Inductive reasoning cannot yield certain universal truth. Therefore, premises that come from inductive reasoning and then used in deductive reasoning will not yield certain universal truth. Again, let's think about that. Deductive reasoning that uses premises from inductive reasoning will not yield certain universal truths. So, if we can't use premises from inductive reasoning in our deductive reasoning to get certain universal truths, we need to find premises that are certain and universally true to begin with. We need premises that are not based on experience. Our answer, once again, we need premises or ideas that do not come from experience. Now the question you might ask yourself is are there ideas that don't come from experience? Some philosophers believe there are. Some philosophers do not believe there are. We will look at both types of philosophers. But let's look for a second at this. Are there ideas that do not come from experience? Philosophers call these a priori ideas. A priori ideas are ideas that are not based on experience. These ideas are considered to be certain, universal, and self-evidently true. And as I said, these are ideas that are not doubtable. They're undoubtable ideas, not based on experience, certain, universal, self-evidently true, and undoubtable. As I said before, some philosophers claim they have discovered a priori ideas. Some philosophers claim a priori ideas do not exist. Let me give you an example for now of philosophers who do believe that there were a priori ideas. These philosophers were the founding fathers of the United States of America. The founding fathers of the United States of America began the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these we hold to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founding fathers were claiming that all men are endowed by their Creator, their equal rights, to have equal rights, and the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founding fathers of the United States were claiming that these were a priori ideas. They then used logic applied to these a priori ideas to create the Declaration of Independence, eventually the Constitution of the United States of America, and eventually to create a new nation in which they claimed the truths that that nation was based on were not individual, were not relative, were not deceptive, were not a matter of experience, but were universal truths, true for all human beings for all time. So now that we've looked at inductive reasoning and we've looked at deductive reasoning, we now know why there are no agreed upon certain answers to philosophical questions. Because the methods that philosophers use to answer philosophical questions are limited by the nature of human mind and experience. Inductive reasoning is limited because experience is limited, relative, and sometimes deceptive. Deductive reasoning or logic is limited because in order to arrive at certain universal truth, we need to start with certain universal truth. And where is that going to come from? Well, we can only get certain universal truth if we believe in a priori ideas. Ideas that do not come from experience and are self-evident and undoubtable. With a priori ideas, we can apply logic and get certain universal truth. Although these methods are flawed, however, they do lead to an incredible amount of knowledge. It may not be agreed by all that it's certain universal truth. However, the knowledge that has been gained using inductive and deductive reasoning has created the civilization that we live in. It has led us to the technologies that have made our lives more comfortable. It has allowed us to build cities and civilizations. The flaws, of course, have left us open to the confusion, the striving, the struggling, and the pain and failure that we experience as well. But, as we saw, that allows for individuation and creation, which is a wonderful thing. Now, inductive and deductive reasoning are not the only methods of knowing, as you might be well aware. There are other methods of knowing that have been used by other cultures and traditions throughout history. These other methods include feelings, intuition, instinct, perhaps even signs and dreams. Philosophers have, throughout most of history, disregarded these other ways of knowing, and they're only being considered again now as people from other cultures and traditions are being included in philosophical dialogue, and actually as women's voices are being heard and are being paid attention to in philosophical debates. Once again, feelings, intuitions, instincts, and dreams and visions have been considered ways of knowing by some, although they remain controversial. They remain controversial because they are extremely flawed. However, as we have seen, inductive and deductive reasoning is flawed. So we're going to look at these other ways of knowing, feelings, instincts, intuitions, dreams, and visions, and see where they will and where they will not be considered acceptable in this course. Let's look at feelings to begin with. Feelings can give us a tremendous amount of information. What inspires us, what enthuses us, can draw us towards our meaning and purpose, can reveal to us our truth. However, it should be obvious that our feelings can also deceive us and lead us in the completely wrong direction. Anyone who has ever fallen in love with the wrong person knows this. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, have had that experience of looking back at someone who you were once deeply and desperately in love with, only to say, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? So our feelings can lead us astray, but they can also provide us with a tremendous amount of information. And this information is important. And perhaps in the field we are looking at, in morality and ethics, it is more important than other types of reasoning. In scientific reasoning, induction and deduction may be sufficient, but perhaps not for ethics. Let us look at an example. Suppose we hear of an accident. A drunk driver has run over a small child and killed that child. Now, a scientific response to that might be to analyze the facts. You can analyze the blood alcohol of the driver. You can measure the tread marks on the road. You can see how fast the car was driving. But all those facts and figures will not tell us anything of the grief and devastation and heartache of that mother who has just lost her child. And it is our sympathy with that grief and that heartache which leads us to our ethical response to a large degree. Perhaps more than any other area, feelings are important in ethics, because in part our ethics do arise from human sympathy, human empathy, and human care. Let me give you another example. 36,000 children will die today of hunger. If that fact outrages you or upsets you, that isn't a response from logic. It's probably not a response from your experience, although some of you might have experienced hunger. Very few of you came close to starvation. So where does that response, that outrage, that hurt that we feel, genuinely feel, when we hear the statistic that 36,000 children will die today of hunger, where does that come from? It comes from our feelings. So our feelings are an important part of our ethics, and they should be included. But we do have to be careful because feelings can lead us astray. So we need to test our feelings. And we will see how to do that in a moment. Another way of knowing that it can be extremely important is intuition, that still small voice within, or our instinct, that gut reaction to something. Our intuitions and our instincts can give us a tremendous amount of information. I'm sure most of you have had that experience of listening to your intuition or listening to your gut and have it turn out to be exactly right, what you felt and what you heard. On the other hand, you probably had the other experience as well, where you didn't listen to your gut, or you didn't listen to your intuition, and everything went wrong. And you learn from that experience to listen to your instincts and intuitions. Well, instincts and intuitions do give us knowledge. They are, on the other hand, very flawed as ways of knowing. There must have been other times when you listened to your gut and it was wrong. Or when you listened to your intuition, but you weren't quite sure if it was intuition or it was something else. Maybe it was your ego talking, or you just really want. You see, there's a lot of voices in our heads. In order to listen to our instincts and intuitions, we have to be able to differentiate those voices. So, we can get information from instinct and intuition, but they can also lead us astray. So we have to test our inner voice. We have to test our gut feelings. We'll talk about that in a second. Finally, there are those who say that dreams and visions can give information. Now, for the more practical among you, that might seem a little ridiculous. But the truth is, Einstein was led to discover the theory of special relativity when the vision of himself riding on a light beam. Barbara McClintock, the famous corn geneticist who won the Nobel Prize, she discovered transposons, the facts that genes jump from chromosome to chromosome. She first discovered this when she had a vision of herself entering into a chromosome, and she saw the genes jumping. Champollion, who translated the Rosetta Stone, the Egyptian hieroglyphics were finally understood after that translation. He was able to do that translation because he had a dream. And in that dream, he dreamed that King of Kings would be the most often repeated phrase on the Rosetta Stone. When he tried it, he was right. And we are now able to know what Egyptian hieroglyphics say. So in each of these cases, these dreams and visions gave incredible information. But of course, each of these famous scientists and researchers tested the information that was given in their dreams. And we must test the information given in our dreams, because the fact is, our dreams also present us with a great deal of fancy, and our dreams often present us with a ton of information, which is absolutely meaningless. So, feelings, instincts, intuitions, dreams, all ways of knowledge, all flawed. Let's look at that. Feelings, they can mislead us. Intuition, very hard to prove it even exists. Instinct, also very hard to prove it exists. And signs, dreams, divinations, when they come, they must be interpreted. So all of these ways of knowing need to be tested. There are 3 tests of truth generally recognized in philosophy, although somewhat controversial on the last one, that we will be using in this course. Use all these ways of knowing, but test them. The coherence test. Is the information logical? Does it fit in with your common sense? Does it fit in with your other beliefs? Or is it contradictory? If it's logical, it passes. But if it's contradictory, it doesn't. For example, it is contradictory to believe it's raining outside and it's not raining outside. It is contradictory to believe in the value of human life and think it's okay for 36,000 children a day to die. That would be contradictory. So check your information against your common sense, against your other beliefs. See it fits in. See if it's logical. All right, the experience test. If you try something out and experience confirms it, then it has passed the test of experience. If you think that your car isn't starting because it needs gas and you put gas in, it starts, the experience has confirmed it. So use examples from your experience to back up what you believe you know. Finally, the pragmatic test. The pragmatic test simply asks, does this knowledge work? Does this idea or belief work? If you test an idea and you find that it makes you more joyful, more alive, more awake, it is a workable idea. Of course, this last test is controversial because some odd things can make people more joyful, alive, and awake. A serial killer may find joy, or claim at least that he does, in doing what he does. Therefore, the pragmatic test, you must make sure that it not only works in your life, makes you more joyful and fulfilled and alive, but it works for the lives of those around you. In this class, those are the 3 tests we'll be using. You should use all forms of belief, all forms of knowledge to find the best possible answers. Use inductive reasoning. Use deductive reasoning. Use feelings, intuition, instinct, and perhaps even dreams or signs. But in all cases, test them with the 3 tests of truth. That way, when you're asked to solve a moral dilemma or an ethical controversy from your own theory, not only will you know how to answer it, you will be able to give the reasons for those answers. And then you will be able to arrive at the best of all possible answers. Okay, so we went through a tremendous amount of information in this program, and a lot of that information is very basic to what you're going to be needing to do in this course. So make sure you read your chapter, the best possible answers, you answer your study questions, and you slowly but surely begin to understand exactly how to create the best possible answers, at least for this course. That way you can get the best of all possible grades. All right, when I see you next time, we will begin our study of philosophers, because not only will we be developing our own best possible answers, one of the ways we will be doing that is by knowing the answers of the great thinkers of all time. So bye-bye, see you next time, have a great night.